everybody. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith Author Event Series. My name is Alex Schaffner. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the store. It doesn't matter what that means, but tonight it means that I get to talk to these two wonderful people. So, thank you for joining, for spending your evening with us in celebration of These Bodies Ain't Broken, edited by Madeline Dyer. We are thrilled to welcome one of the book's contributors, author Finn Leary. Yes. As well as Page Street Senior Young Adult Editor, Tamara Grasty. It is great to welcome in the wicked month of October with a discussion of, yes, spooky stuff, but also a strong dose of conversation about disability, queerness, empowerment, and more. These Bodies Ain't Broken is a young adult anthology that embraces horror but asks that it do more. A love letter to a genre that often forgets the people who love it, These Bodies Ain't Broken wrenches the macabre away from its long-standing traditions of marginalizing, murdering, and monsterifying disabled bodies. Instead of making villains and victims out of difference, this is a book about how disability doesn't mean that you don't survive or that you're the bad guy. I'm going to let Finn tell you all about their story. Suffice to say, Kissed by Death is a story about finding joy and beauty in all the dead places. Finn Leary is the editor of the science fiction anthology Future States of Stars. They are a contributor to this book. Their fiction has been supported by the 2025 Tin House Winter Workshop, the Changemaker Authors Cohort through Narrative Initiative, and the Grub Street Novel Generator Program. They were a 2024 Lambda Literary Emerging LGBTQ+ Voices Fellow for Young Adult Fiction, and a 2024 Publishers Weekly Star Watch honoree. Finn is also a program manager for We Need Diverse Books, a role that they follow wholeheartedly into their own writing. Tamara Grasty is a senior young adult fiction editor at Page Street Publishing. Novels they've edited include instant New York Times bestsellers, a National Book Award finalist, and a Lambda Award-nominated anthology, amongst many other titles. Their editorial interests gravitate towards works that center marginalized identities of many forms. When they're not working, they're probably gossiping on the phone, getting ready for book club, or watching video essays, all of which I think are wonderful things to be doing with your time. Both of tonight's panelists are wonderfully local, and it's a pleasure to have them here. Please welcome Finn and Tamara. Tamara, could you start by introducing us to the book itself?
Yeah, so I acquired this anthology with Madeline Dyer, who is also the editor. Editor is a confusing word in this case because editor is both the head author in an anthology and also me. And so I've worked with Madeline Dyer before on another book called Being Ace, and when she approached me with this horror disability anthology, I was like, this is for us. Page Street is based in Salem. We love horror. We love marginalization of all kinds, a lot of queer authors. And so that's where this book came from for me, is it was gift wrapped to me by a person I'd already worked with and trusted, and I was so excited to be able to do something like this with Page Street.
Fantastic. And we'll touch more on sort of the process of how this book came together. But Finn, I would love it if you would talk a bit about your story in particular. Give us sort of an introduction to what we can expect from this story.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. I wrote Kissed by Death last August, and this is a story that takes place in Provincetown, Massachusetts, a coastal town right at the tip of Cape Cod that has a long history of being extremely LGBTQ friendly and having many, many, many queer community members, as well as the longest running transgender event in the world, Trans Week, which is happening in a couple of weeks, and I'll be there. And so I was really drawn to writing about that setting and centering my protagonist, Luca, who uses they and she pronouns, who is an agender teenager with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a disability that I also share, and Luca's best friend, Alana, who uses she, her pronouns, and who has been dead or presumed dead for a couple of years now, except actually, she's not dead. She knocks on the window, and she is hungry for revenge and also for blood because she has been turned into a vampire. So I was kind of inspired a little bit by Jennifer's Body, by queer themes in horror, and just by my love of Provincetown and the beach, and my desire to, vampires cannot go out in the sun, stereotypically in mythology, and there's just something about, what if you grew up or spent most of your life in a coastal town and then you couldn't go out in the sun? That sounds horrible to me.
Well, let's talk about the title as sort of a starting point. Was that an early part of the project, and is it something that was in place when you were approached about the anthology?
Oh, me?
Both of you, yeah.
The titles for These Bodies Ain't Broken came this way. I was so excited it hit right away. It's so snappy, it's so defiant, and I know that that's what this anthology was going to be about, and so it stayed from the second it hit my inbox. It was always going to be These Bodies Ain't Broken, no questions.
And is that, what did you know about the theme of the book? Were you approached with it already in mind? What point in the process were you brought on board, basically?
Is this for me? Because I love telling this story.
Yes, please tell this story.
So this is actually a little bit of weird audacity on my part. I follow Madeline Dyer on Instagram, and I have, I think, since Being Ace was released, I got an early copy of Being Ace. I also have a finished copy of it. It's beautiful. It's on the purple shelf of my rainbow bookshelf. So when she announced that this book was coming out, I actually commented on her Instagram post, and I was like, any chance that all of the contributors have been assigned? Which is a really wild thing to do and not something that I normally do. I typically go through proper channels, y'all, for submissions processes, and I had an editor lovingly yell at me back in January after accepting my work for a future anthology, and they said, "Why did you go through proper channels? Why didn't you just email me?" And I was like, Jordan, we weren't friends. How would I have known to do that? That's wild. Yeah, we're friends now, but at the time you were just a person with authority who could make decisions about my career. So I had Jordan's voice in my head a little bit there, and I figured I would try in a polite, respectful, and thoughtful way. And to my surprise, Madeline was like, send me a pitch. Here is my email address. And then I was like, oh my God, I have to send someone a pitch? So of course I go to my notes app where I keep all of my book and writing ideas, including my short stories ideas, and I just look through my notes app and I'm like, can any of these possibly fit? I'm like, I have a couple of days. Do any of these ideas hit at all? And this was an idea, this was a seed that I had in my notes app. Basically, I think at the time all I had was queer teenager, in love with best friend dies, shows up as a vampire years later. And I was like, all right, this is it, that's the one, I gotta turn this into a story, let's go. I was really overjoyed that Page Street was into that and that Madeline was into that, and then I had a deadline and actually had to turn it into a story.
Yeah, it was actually quite the surprise because Madeline Dyer had a short list of people who were going to be approached for the anthology and then filled in the rest of the list with some later calls. And so this anonymous Word document shows up where it's like, yep, and here's everyone else I'm considering that I have pitches from. And I scrolled through it and I'm like, Finn Leary, we went to school together. He didn't tell me he was applying. Why is this here? How did you find me?
How would I find you?
How?
I agree, the title is very snappy. I think it's going to catch people's attention very, very well. And I would like to talk a bit about its defiance and about ways of thinking about disability. How does the idea that disability is not brokenness resonate with you, and how does it show up in your work?
I always just think about the fictional love of my life, Kaz Brecker from Six of Crows by Lee Bardugo.
From the sidelines.
Somebody else is a Kaz fan. I love to see that. it was just the first time in fiction that I had ever seen a character who is, you know, visibly disabled and a cane user, and also really just happy with who he is and defiant and did not want to be defined by that sense of brokenness. And I found it very beautiful that in Six of Crows, you know, there is magic. So theoretically, one could heal oneself. You don't actually have to have a disability. And he actively chooses not to. And there's a really wonderful quote about that choice being something that is intentional. And at the time when I read that book, I was just on the cusp of being diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is not what Kaz has, not what Leigh Bardugo has, but I had never seen many depictions of cane users, honestly, and I was using a cane part of the time during those years, and it really honestly made me feel powerful. It was the first time that I felt like having a disability wasn't going to completely define me as separate from my peers, as not interesting, as not capable of going out to social events, as not fun, as not sexy, which I did actually say to Leigh Bardugo when I finally met her, and then I was like, I wish I hadn't gone on such a long tangent about how much I love your work. But it shows up because I really do feel like that kind of portrayal can make such a difference for young people. And I read that story when I was like 24, 25, and it shaped the remainder of my 20s into my 30s. And I just hope that for young readers who are reading this as teenagers, that they get that sense that they are not broken, that they are not different, that you can absolutely be a part of society, you can be, you know, proud and proudly and openly disabled and still really live a wonderful life that way.
Well, and something that I like about your story and the stories that a lot of disabled writers tell is that you allow Luca to be a complete person who is satisfied in herself, but at the same time, their struggles don't disappear. Like, having a disability does affect them, it just doesn't diminish them. And I think that's a really interesting balance to strike. So how do you approach that?
Differently with every story, if I'm being totally honest. In this one, I really did think about the role that disability was going to play, and in writing a story where all of the other authors were also disabled, it actually really took the pressure off. Like, there's not just one story that is speaking for everybody in a community or feels like it can be speaking for everybody. And because of that, I just decided that it really wasn't going to be part of the plot at all. There is a lot in there about queer shame and trans shame and internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia, some intersections with race and religion, but there isn't a lot on the page about internalized ableism or that particular experience, and that's because I felt that freedom of being in an anthology with other disabled authors, and I really wanted to write a protagonist who had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and that was on the page. It affects their life, it affects her choices, but it's not the reason that the horror is happening. It's not the reason that, you know, we're in this situation. It's not even the reason for the shame. The shame is like, oh my God, my best friend is a vampire and I still think she's hot. What do I do?
Tamara, could you talk a bit about, you know, we're talking about this whole book is full of a multiplicity of disabled experiences. What was the process like to make sure that that diversity within the book existed? And what are some of the other experiences that we can look forward to in reading the rest of these stories?
So, Maddie, the editor on this, had a really big hand in shaping a lot of the stories because she has such a big community of disabled writers. She has Ehlers-Danlos as well, and a number of other named disabilities. And in working through this anthology, we wanted to make sure there were disabilities that overlapped even, and so there are multiple stories about characters with Ehlers-Danlos and different ways it affects them. And so one person uses a cane, one person is a wheelchair user, one person doesn't use any mobility aids. And like the way that these issues actually have a lot of different ways they can play out And so we wanted to have ADHD and PTSD and agoraphobia and all of these other things, and sometimes multiply intersecting things that we could discuss, because a lot of times if you have one disability, you have another disability. And so
Unfortunately, yes.
And so the other major thing that we were sort of thinking about in sort of the representation of this, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead a little bit,
No.
is that we included essays about each disability in the anthology, so that way you don't have to wonder what the story is about. You don't have to wonder which things are being portrayed on the page. You can experience the story. It can be a subtle background detail. It can be in all of these little touches. And I feel like there are so many moments where readers will read something and say, I didn't see that at all. Or they don't recognize that that's what people are going for, what they're purposefully including. And so in using these essays, they're also giving readers, and especially young readers, a chance to connect with specific moments on the page and to see how all of these things are intersecting.
Well, and I think that the essays at the end of each piece are an interesting and useful choice, because this book is, you know, a lot of horror is in conversation with its own genre, but this is doing it in a very pointed and very specific way. And by having these essays from the authors that directly address their stories, you're sort of inviting the reader into the conversation in, I think, a really meaningful way. So I think that's a great choice, and I think that when people read the whole book, I think it'll be interesting for them to see the fiction and the nonfiction sort of like slide up against each other in interesting ways. So vampires. What do you think of them? Why did you pick them? And how is that a great place to explore disability?
As you can tell by my outfit, I have never thought about vampires before, and I hate them outside of the story. No, I have really long been drawn to vampires, and I think that so often I have been drawn to them in ways that are not necessarily about the horror, right? Because vampires show up in fantasy, and they show up in, you know, a lot of romantasy novels where the focus is on, oh wow, this person is, there's a power dynamic and they're so sexy, and also they're like 305. And for some reason that grips people. I really was drawn to this idea of vampirism and consumption and devouring as a metaphor for love and romance and attraction, and that idea, that nugget, came before I knew that I would ever have it published anywhere. These ideas are always in my notes app and in my heart, banging around just like in a closet somewhere, waiting to be released. And I just think that vampires are a really interesting place to explore all of the things that make us human and the things that make us feel really inhuman as well, because as a vampire you are cast out from society in a lot of ways. There are these barriers, and I thought that that would be really interesting to explore in this particular anthology with, you know, all disabled authors with on-the-page disability. I really thought through the representation that I was going to have, the choices of, you know, having the protagonist have EDS, which I have, versus having their best friend have a disability, which would be a different choice since she's the one that's actually a vampire. And that's something I want to explore more in future portrayals of vampirism. But what I really wanted to do there was just look at the way that our bodies shape our experience. And in this story, kind of mild spoiler alert, the protagonist is not daunted by this idea of someone being turned into a vampire. Like, she just immediately is like, yep, I'm on board, we're in it, we're locked in, let's go, bestie. And I really...
Yeah, they really respond to it very well.
I really wanted that. I really wanted that on the page, because I do think there is something about, like, when you have been raised in a disabled body, when you have been raised as a trans person, as a queer person, and you've known that from a very young age, you've had to contend with this lifelong understanding of being a monster, of being a freak, of being perceived as one. So it just follows that, like, if you met an actual quote-unquote monster, especially if it's someone that you already knew and loved, like, your response is not going to be shock and terror and running away, probably. It's going to be like, you know what, actually, I kind of like this weird, monster guy. I'm going to feed him some eggs. That's just a Shape of Water reference. It's not to do with this.
Yeah, I would like to talk a bit about horror as a genre, because one of the main points of this collection is to sort of fight back against what a really wonderful category of storytelling really horribly does to large swaths of people who sometimes are the ones who most enjoy consuming it. So I would love it if you could talk about where you've seen disability occupy a place in horror that you have read, and whether you have seen that tide change at all in the last few years. That's for both of you, because I assume that both of you have read a horror novel before, and perhaps even seen a movie.
Yeah, this is kind of a lot. I'm like, oh yeah, gotta really paint that the pictures. In the audience is a dear former roommate of mine who is much more obsessed with horror than I have ever been, who's exposed to many, many, many horror films. And so I just have like a backlog of scrolling films going through my mind. But I feel like even as I'm working, I still haven't seen the disability portrayals in fiction I want to see. And obviously Kaz Brecker, wonderful exception, but there are so many others that I feel like I'm still fighting against and still running into and tired of. And so I feel like I'm still actively in my acquisitions work trying to make space for stories that are not doing more harm, rather than thinking of all the wonderful, inspiring things that I'm sure are existing. I'm trying to make more as well.
Yeah, I can agree that we've seen a change in the landscape, I think, in both movies and books slowly, but I also similarly have really not seen the levels of disability representation that I would love to see, honestly, on the page. I think about this probably every, if not most of the time when I'm watching a horror movie, like whether or not somebody who's a wheelchair user or uses a mobility aid is going to be able to make it out. Like, I do think, A Quiet Place series is a notable exception to that. There was that one movie where Bird Box, where being blind was also a real point of the story.
Yeah, if you're not familiar with Bird Box, it's the one where the world shuts down and it's if you see something, then everything goes wrong, and you never, as far as I know, find out what the thing is, because if you see it, it goes wrong. And that's also a book by Josh Mallerman, and if you're interested in reading it, it is in our horror section right now. Yes, those are very, very exceptions. I will take a little sideways direction here, because I, myself as a horror reader, think that we have a very long way to go in terms of disability representation in horror, but something else that's present in your story that I am seeing a lot of is trans representation in horror. And there have been so many good horror novels written in the last 3, 4, 5 years by trans authors about trans characters, often gripping in really complicated, meaty, and often very disgusting ways, with things like transphobia, both internal and external. So I think that is a direction where we may actually be going in a good way. At least in horror novels, it's looking great. But I think disability, to this day, I'm reading things and I'm just not seeing it. So I think that is one of the great pieces of value of this anthology, because you're striking back at something that's so integral to the historical practices of horror writing. Let's see, where do I want to, Luca, as you said at the beginning, Luca is agender, uses she and they. How did that part of the character come up for you? How did you decide how she would identify and what she would be like?
Characters decide for me. I really wish that I could say it was more intentional than that I had a real thought there. Honestly, aside from wanting more characters who use multiple sets of pronouns and actually switch them up regularly, that's like the only thing I can really point to as like, you don't see that a lot and I wanted to be a part of that. But genuinely, truly, the characters show up for me in my heart with their names and pronouns and some of those backstory details, and I usually have absolutely no say. Like, I will go into a story with an idea of what I want it to be, with an idea of who I want these people to be, but they are gonna show me and almost always take it in a direction that's unexpected, and that is just, as soon as I started writing the scene, as soon as I started jumping into their headspace, I was like, this is a person who switches it up pronouns-wise, like, within the very paragraph.
Yeah, within the sentence even. There are certain points where you're alternating it pretty much one-to-one. And I think that is so interesting because it takes a minute to get used to it. Even if you're somebody who spends a lot of time with people who use multiple pronouns, it's so unusual to see it in writing in quite that way. And I think it was a bold and interesting and good choice. So I'm glad that you went in that direction because it means that you're not really letting your character's identity slip by unnoticed. Like, it's important and you make it important. You put it on the page. And I think that is very cool. Now, her relationship with Alana is super interesting because, as you said, they are best friends and also they are in love with her. So can you talk a little bit about what queer friendship can be like for teens and where that dividing line might get blurry?
Jennifer's Body, let's watch it right now.
Okay, we have a screen, we'll just pull it down.
I'm gonna pull it up and just make you all do homework before you finish this talk. Honestly, I think that it's such a great question. I really was inspired pretty distinctly by my experience of watching Jennifer's Body when I was 12 or 13. To be totally honest, like, that movie came out and my dad was like, we have to watch this. And I was like, I can't watch this with my dad. And he was like, I love having a queer daughter, we have to watch this. So we watched it. And that is, what has shaped me. That is what I wanted to put into the story and put on the page, that, Luca is a character who has canonically two moms, right? Like, this is a person who has grown up in Provincetown, where there are drag shows every weekend, where there are pride flags everywhere, where, queerness is accepted, and yet, there is a piece in the story, a small, tiny little tidbit that I put in there that actually came from the very first time I went to Provincetown with my family, with my cousins, when I was like 12 or 13 years old. And at the time, I was out to my dad and one of my cousins, and that was it. Nobody else in my family knew that I was queer. And we went into town on this beautiful day in this queer location, and there was an anti-gay protest. There were anti-gay protesters in the queerest place on Cape Cod, in the state that first legalized same-sex marriage in 2004. I had always grown up hearing, this is the place where it's safe. I had grown up with this queer, friendly, parenting experience with, being surrounded by this and being surrounded by support, and yet this was not always the case, and that shame and that feeling makes its home inside of you so deeply as a young person. Every single time I move, I look through my Lisa Frank diary from 2004, which has my very first entry of admitting my bisexuality that I erased with water afterwards. And that's why I wanted to explore this friendship, this idea that, queer friendship can be complicated, can be confusing, not only because we have this internalized shame, not only because it is hard, but also because like being a person is really hard. And I don't know that I was doing this incredibly intentionally, but I identify as being on the aromantic spectrum, and I think that comes out in a lot of my fiction. I think that, you know, exploring the closeness between friends, exploring what it looks like to care for somebody, exploring what affection and attraction even mean to individual people is something that I find absolutely fascinating and always will. And again, just like Jennifer's body, like you don't ever know sometimes in a media portrayal whether characters are like, you can spend the whole time arguing back and forth with your friends. Are they in love with each other or are they not? And I love not being able to answer that. I hope you never get to answer that. I hope that I confuse people with my fiction and maybe my life forever.
It's wonderful. So you write longer pieces as well, and Tamara, you have edited longer pieces. So as this is a short story anthology, could both of you just take a stab at what the process for creating or editing stories of this length is? What's significantly different from when you're working on a larger piece? Or are there things about short stories and novels that are weirdly similar in approach?
I think the advice for short stories is that every single line has to be so hardworking. You do not want anything that could be cut and the story wouldn't change. And so it is a much harder task for a writer to do because I work with a lot of novelists. I think a lot of people in here are more novelists than short story writers necessarily. Not that they don't do a wonderful job, but just that sometimes they want to run long. Sometimes they want to tell you a lot of things that I don't know need to be there. And so I get very red pen about it. And there are still a couple of longer ones in here, but boy, did I cut them down. And I think that that's probably the biggest difference is a novel has a lot of room to breathe, a lot more room for quiet moments or ambiguous moments, and not that there are no quiet or ambiguous moments in short stories, but like they have to be really meaning it. You cannot leave a dangling thing here and not get around to it because we have 20 pages, let's go. And so it's really refreshing to work on an anthology because in this case I worked in batches, and so I only had to read a handful of stories at a time, and you feel so accomplished so quickly because there are things that are technically done. And it's really nice because some people really do work on their short story writing quite a bit, and so things can come in so clean even before I see them. And there's nothing better. There's nothing better than not having to try that hard to polish something up, because some people are really, really good at polishing on their own. And so overall, a lot of what I spend my time doing and what I think is most fun about an anthology is sort of the ordering. Working on titles and that sort of thing, this sort of big picture stuff, because the people who are writing don't know all the other stories in the anthology. They don't know that they're writing in conversation with other people. And so you have to spend a lot of time and space making sure that the genres feel balanced, making sure that, in this case, there are like 3 stories in the second person inexplicably. And so there are all these sort of little details and stylistic choices and genre conventions that play off better if they have more space to breathe between them. And it's really fun working on titles.
I'm just going to interrupt for one moment to say that I have read 3 speculative fiction novellas published within the last 4 months that are in the second person.
Something's in the water.
What is it?
You.
Yeah, I can attest to how many. I'm like, there is a Jungian dream palace somewhere that all the writers are collectively dreaming about. You would not believe the level of specifics that things can have in common for people who have never spoken to each other. And so
it's crazy, and it happens in books all the time.
Yeah.
You'll see 2 books come out within 3 days of each other, and they're not friends.
No.
They're not the same house.
Yeah.
And yet, conceptually, almost identical. It's really amazing.
Yeah, so at least with an anthology, I can decide that things are not too similar, and I can weed things out or redirect people or make sure we're saying something new. And so it's not that anything in here is samey, but boy, sometimes everyone wants to write in the second person all of a sudden, and you have to ask them why.
I'm happy to say, and Finn, we'll move back to your answer to this question in a moment. I am happy to say that all three of the novellas that I'm thinking of had good reasons.
Yes, yes.
So,
these were
well
also
done, everybody.
These were also very fun.
Yes.
And I was like, it's just a weird thing that's happening, but I like it.
So Finn, yes, short story versus long story. What do you do?
What a great question. I think that you kind of really covered it as somebody that writes novels, but also I'm editing an anthology, so I'm literally in the process that you just described where we had to be like, how many stories about robots are there? Why are there none? I was like, that's actually wild. We have to change this, put some robots in every story. So, you know, that's a balance that you have to strike when you are working with a number of authors. As a writer, I think you're totally right. It also really means like cutting a lot of beautiful backstory, cutting a lot of beautiful scenes and feelings that you don't want to cut. And as somebody that is really drawn to writing longer stories, like every single idea that I have could easily be a novel. So if anybody wants it to be and wants to pay me money to make it a novel ever, that's cool, and you should do that. But I think that also most but not all of my novel ideas could also be cut down in some way to become a short story. It's just like, what are the essential pieces of this? Can we cut any characters? Can we cut any of this backstory? Like, if you really had to take the absolute essentials of the plot, what would those be? And how could you tell that story in a short way? Because I could absolutely turn this into a novel easily and give them so much more to do and give them so much more conflict and, you know, emotional arcs and narrative plot. But there's just not room for that when you have like 6,000 words.
Yeah, with a short story, to a certain degree, it limits the number of ideas you can have simultaneously. A novel, there's so much room for ideas to overlap and interweave, and for many different things to be. If you guys haven't read, speaking of horror novels that are good, if you guys haven't read Bat Eater yet, you should read Bat Eater. It's by Kylie Lee Baker, who is also local, and it is a book that has so many ideas in it that I don't know how she brought them all to their reasonable endpoint, but she did, and it does not stop. And that's something you can do in a novel. You can't do that here, so you find yourself having to hone down what you're doing into one or two things that you deeply care about. What do you think the things that you deeply cared about in this short story are?
Yeah, you absolutely nailed it. Like, I really did have to winnow down my ideas and choose what mattered most. And I think there would have been a lot more of a nuanced portrayal of what it's like to have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and be broke, living in a town known for expensive tourism. And I just didn't have room for that. So I think that, you know, some of the things that I really did want to explore were identity, this idea that you can have a lot of internalized homophobia or transphobia, even if you're raised in a community that is quote unquote, like, it's safe to be queer here, like, that you can still have that level of shame. I wanted to explore what it means to be a monster, what it looks like to be hungry, the vampirism metaphor for love and friendship and connection. And I wanted to honestly explore a little bit of like teen bullying as well. And that one kind of surprised me. I was not expecting that when I first set out to write this story, and I just, like, it just came onto the page and I was like, okay, well, I guess we're gonna talk about this now. So it's a present theme that I was not anticipating.
Yeah, and by the time the complete version of the story has a lot of that in there too. So it asserted itself in a pretty major way for this story. Which is actually interesting, because one of the threads that I most wanted to tease out was the idea of befriending your own bully when circumstances change. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, or if you just want these folks to read the story and think about it. Do you have any thoughts on that theme?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really just wanted to, and thank you for asking and bringing that up, is how much we change when somebody that we love dies, right? And it's not a spoiler, she comes back as a vampire, we know she's not really dead, right? That happens. But like, you think that your best friend is dead. That is a horrifying thing to have happen, and loss fundamentally changes you. It changes who you are, it changes your relationship with yourself and the world and with other people, and I really did want to explore the idea that we can be shaped by that, and that sometimes that leads to becoming a different person than you ever set out to be. It leads to making choices that you didn't expect to make. Sometimes, especially if you're a teenager, it leads to making choices that you didn't want to make and that you probably shouldn't have made, and that like if you could go back you wouldn't. And that's, you know, I really wanted this idea that like there's something there, I think, that's really beautiful and horrifying about what would somebody that I care about think of me if they could come back and see the version of me that is here today, that has changed in the years that they've been gone. And that is really at the crux of what I wanted to explore, more so even than just befriending your bully or, you know, being in that kind of situation, but just like that sense that you don't know what that person would think of the life that you've created. You don't know what they would think of the people you've lost, of the people that you've hurt, of the people that you've gained.
That's a wonderful answer, thank you. Tamara, you say Page Street is in Salem and you love horror. Can you tell us a little bit about what else Page Street has to offer these fine readers when it comes to excellent horror?
There are so many things. I'm just thinking today another one of my books came out called Blood and Breath by Coraline. This is like a revenge story, and so it's got like a fair bit of like blood and gore and angst and things of this nature, and I do think it is very horror adjacent if it is not horror proper. It's arguable. I would say I think you can call it horror. And then I also have several books with an author who actually blurbed for this book, Catherine Yu, who wrote Direwood and The Devils and the Dancers, which came out earlier this year, as well as Helga, which is a Frankenstein retelling that I love. It is a horror comedy. We have Resting Peaches by my wonderful coworker Lauren Knowles. We have It Looks Like Us, which is the Thing retelling. We have so many things.
Allison Ames is great. If you haven't read any Allison Ames, you need to read her books. The first one was so romantic and so scary.
Yeah, Allison Ames is great. I'm trying to think who else is in here. There are so many. This is actually a really hard test. Didn't expect to be quizzed.
No, you've done great. Don't worry. Let's see, I have two more things that I want to talk about, and then we will do your questions, but I can tell that we could stay here. Well, I could stay here forever continuing to ask things, but at some point I bet all of you would like me to stop. So I will ask just the ones that I feel most strongly about, and then we'll get to all of you. So first of all, we haven't touched on how important music is as a theme, both in terms of highlighting the vampirism and in being like an undergirding part of friendship. So how did the music come into this book? What is into this story? What is the music in this story? And what is it accomplishing there?
I'm going to try so hard not to talk for 55 minutes about Gerard Way. Please stop me if I do.
Why would I stop you?
That, for me, actually really comes from like a personal touchstone. A lot of this story was inspired by a real queer friendship that I had with one of my best friends, Mary, who I met when I was in middle school and bonded with over the fact that My Chemical Romance was her absolute favorite band in the entire world. And this was one of my first times in my entire life having a friend who was queer and knew that she was queer and was dating another girl. I was like, oh my God, girls are kissing? That's crazy. What else can we do? And of course, you know, there was such a freedom in that. There was such a beautiful power in sharing that and bonding over that. And she died in a car accident when I was 19. Her and her mom were hit head-on in a collision in Florida at an intersection. And I really struggled to listen to MCR for years after she died because I couldn't help but think of her and think of what I missed about that friendship and think about, in my opinion, not to think about Taylor Swift's new song, Ruin the Friendship, but all the things that we don't say and how that can come back to haunt you when someone dies. And I really felt like that was something that I wanted to explore here. That was something that just, that music, that commonality really anchored that friendship. And for me, in the years after her death, I have been able to come back around in finding another close friend who also loves MCR just as much as Mary did. And we went to their concert together and spent hours getting dressed up and preparing for that. And I never wanted to see them live without her, unless I could see them with somebody that would feel that strongly and would be just as hyped to be there and to be sharing that experience and to be just like standing for every song, screaming for every song. And this friend sent me a text really early into our friendship that was basically like, the next time they tour, we are gonna go and we're gonna put her picture in the locket. And I took a screenshot of that text because I was so moved that somebody cared enough about my dead friend that they never got to meet to want to do that someday. And that's really honestly what drove me to want to write about this, because I think that the music that connects the two of them, the fact that they're bonding over this, like, I don't know about y'all, but like I'm connecting with my friends about music constantly. I went to an 11 p.m. showing of The Life of a Showgirl release party with my friends. Like we are constantly sending each other 27-minute long voice notes about stuff. And that is so strong when you're a teenager. You're just developing your sense of music. You're just developing those connections. So even though I was a little nervous about putting MCR on the page and being like, are teenagers gonna know who they are?
Oh, well, you've been to the show, so now you know the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I do.
So many teenagers, just an ungodly number of teenagers. It's lovely to see. It's nice, I mean, not to also go on a tangent, but it's really nice to see a band that's been around for 25 years have old people and young people. That is the sign of a very healthy musical ecosystem. But yeah, I think it's amazing that you have this history and friendship, and the way that I think it's very brave to quite literally put that on a page of a story in this way, because it's just, you're drawing so deeply on something very meaningful, and you have chosen to just put it out there, and I think that takes a certain amount of courage that I appreciate as a reader and sitting here. The one other thing that I think we might want to mention is that this is Banned Books Week. And I don't know if anyone has noticed the state of book banning in the US right now. It's more. Prior to the last 5 years, there was an average of 221 titles challenged or banned per year in the US. This year, it is already in the multi-thousands of unique titles. Most of these are concentrated efforts from organized groups, submitting hundreds of titles simultaneously for removal. And what you may notice if you read into this at all is that this book contains a lot of the things that like to get banned. So I noticed that you, in your essay at the end of your story, talk a little bit about Timothy Snyder in a way that I think is really relevant to Banned Books Week and to the content of the book. So could you talk about what you say and how it relates to this non-celebratory week that we have?
Yeah, I don't remember word for word exactly what I wrote, but I did quote Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny, which, this quote had been going around quite a lot in the rise of totalitarianism, fascism, and, Project 2025 and everything that's been happening politically, that we should not comply in advance, that an authoritarian government thrives on the idea that we will lay down and stop doing things before we are asked to. And it felt really important to me to quote that because that is the antithesis of who I am as a person and what I want my work to stand for. I think often about the moment when I first came out as trans in 2023. I was talking to my friend Trish, who is 65, and she said, I have been around 65 years, and this is the worst it's been to be trans in my lifetime, I think. This is the hardest that it's been, so why the heck would you come out now? No offense. And I was like, because they don't want us to. They don't want us to come out. They don't want us to be public. They don't want us to be proud. And I felt that, at least for me, it was my moral imperative, actually, to be myself, that I owed it to my community to be myself in that way, because I knew that I was non-binary, probably since like 2016 or 2017, and I felt like I actually owed that to people. So I do believe that, not complying in advance is a really wonderful way to make sure that we fight back, that we continue to advocate, and we don't lose sight of that importance of that. And, to that end, like, a main reason why I wanted to come out, honestly, was because I wanted to put trans characters in like every single story I ever write. So far, fingers crossed, that's like working. So I'm not gonna stop, and maybe at some point I'll write a book where there's only cis people, but we'll have to see.
I just choked on my own spit. One moment. That's never happened in an event before. Okay, we're good. Tamara, do you feel that Page Street has been able to respond to changing climates in publishing in kind of a similar way to Finn? Like, have you been able to continue publishing voices that will be objected to? Have you been able to continue financing stories that people want to dismiss and hide?
One wonderful thing about Page Street is that they're an independent, and so there are very few people who tell me what to do. Basically no one, actually. It's really nice in that way, but we have never had a mandate to make queer stories, to make trans stories, to make people of color in stories, to do any of these things, and it's just because we want to. And they keep showing up, and we keep making those stories, and we keep taking swings. And so I do the things that speak to me, and what do I care about? I care about Black people, I care about trans people, I care about queer characters. I have to have some token straights here and there. They can be lovely too. But the point being that we have never been told by anyone in our programming to stop doing what we're doing. This is what we care about, this is what we do, this is what we make, this is who we're for. And I am glad to be in a place that's really steadfast in that and that has never questioned my desire to put marginalized identities at the front of stories.
All right. Well, that is all of my questions. Thank you for answering them so beautifully. Yes, you can clap now. No one else can. Do you guys have questions? We have several minutes.
Please ask the weirdest question you can think of. I'm daring you.
And do it really loud so the live stream can hear it. Yes.
Is the publication process for an anthology somewhat different compared to a novel? Is it more like a proposal that you would get for like a nonfiction piece, really?
Okay, so I will repeat that question for the camera. Jake, another friend of mine, was asking how the anthology publication process differs from a traditional novel, standard novel fiction. And so in this case, yes, you're right, it is a bit more like a nonfiction proposal. I was given a title, a list of authors who were on board, their pitches, approximately how many people were going to be in this, and the general conceit. And so I did sign on the proposal, and that is the scariest part of all, because as an editor, I usually have the whole story before I sign it. And so for anthologies, it's a big leap of faith, and you have to really trust the people who are organizing this sort of thing, because you don't know what you're going to get. And sometimes you get things that you do not wish were the way they are. So luckily, everything came out very beautifully on this one, but there are always things behind the scenes that make this process a bit more difficult than I think a traditional novel is. It's a lot of people, it's a lot of personalities, it's a lot of deadlines. And when you add more authors with more deadlines, they don't get better at it. So it is a little harder, but in other ways it is much easier, because you can work on things while other people are revising things, while other people are writing things, and so you can really work in batches and have teams, and sometimes the story gets cut. Sometimes you have a last minute addition, and so there are some more flexibility in ways that an anthology is put together.
In writing and editing like a YA anthology, especially for horror, are there lines that you like to keep it YA as opposed to adult, like that are hard, or are they like, do you advise authors, or like do authors just kind of go in knowing like this is the vibe? Like, how do you do that line between YA and adult for horror?
I feel like we both are gonna have something to say about this, because I do want to know what you would say, and I think it. Oh right, yes, they asked us about how we know what the line is in YA horror specifically, since we're writing for young adults. How do you know what you can do on the page? And at least for me, I am just trying to take care of readers when I'm writing, so I'm just keeping in mind, like, teenagers have a lot of autonomy, and they can be scared, and they can handle more than we think that they can, but also just having some sense of care for the experience that they're going to have. I think YA horror maybe as a whole leans a little more like hopeful. Not always. I still think you can get some of those more like the Mist level endings, but you're not gonna get like the Mist level endings in many YA horror where you're like, oh, everyone's just, this is awful.
Yeah, so for me, I think the thing that is the biggest, people often ask me like, what is YA? Why is it like this? How do you know? And people often want to look down on it, but I feel like what I really love about this genre is that they will not do anything to hurt you that they're not going to explore. I feel like so much of adult horror gets away with putting in gratuitous scenes, moments of violence that don't necessarily actually add too much on the page. And they can do that because they assume you're an adult and that you can handle yourself. But when you presume a younger reader, when you presume a teen reader, you want to make sure that the things you are including need to be there, and that the things you are saying that are difficult are going to be explored. And so that's really the line for me, and so I will not include anything that does not need to be there. And so I have removed a couple of sexual assaults from this book, or from stories that were not willing to address it in the way that it needed to be addressed to be a part of a young adult anthology.
I think I saw another hand a minute ago. Did it disappear?
Follow up on that. So, what about non-sexual assault? What is the process there?
This question was, what about sex scenes that are not sexual assault scenes in YA? I don't think that it ever comes up in this particular anthology, but I do other fiction, obviously. And so my rule is, again, if it is relevant, if it needs to be there, then it can be there. But it is not going to be there for like titillation purposes. It's going to be there to explore a young person's experience of sexual activity, because young people have sex. Young people have friends who have sex, and this is a part of the culture and a part of their lives that they need to be able to talk about and to explore safely. And so it's not that it can't happen, it's that when it happens, it has to be relevant, it has to be explored, it has to be about from the perspective of someone who is younger. And that's what it's really for when I've included it.
I think we have time for one more.
Yes. Is this your first time writing within the horror genre? And if so, what has that process been like compared to writing within other genres?
Oh, this is a good question. The question is this my first time writing in the horror genre? And how is that different compared to other genres? And explicitly, yes, a little bit. I did write a different vampire story that will come out in a horror fantasy anthology probably in 2027. And that one blurs the lines between fantasy and horror. I was leaning towards horror when I wrote it. When I drafted it, I was going towards horror rather than fantasy. But that being said, that anthology is both, and I think it could be read as both, and I think it could, in the editing process, be more ambiguous and end up more in that fantasy realm. So this is the first time that I, for myself personally, was writing explicitly in horror with that intention in mind. And a lot of what I was thinking about is how I love that horror creates this beautiful distance between our real life fears and some sort of metaphor or some sort of externalization. There's like a monster in the closet, there's a thing in the dark, there's a transformation, there's body horror, whatever it is, there's some sort of externalization, and that distance makes it easier to look at those fears. Fear of abandonment, fear of grieving somebody, like fear of whatever it is. You're able to look at it because you're not looking directly at it.
All right, well, I think that's time. Thank you again so much for your wonderful answers to mine and everyone else's questions. Thank you for this story and this lovely book, which has, well, as you can see, we just filled an hour talking about one story, and this book has many more. So get yourself a copy, or 4 or 10 copies over at the register right there. The only other thing that I would like to point out, if I can find the details on the piece of paper that I deliberately wrote them down on, yes. Well, one of the things that I do sometimes is be on the YA programming committee for the Boston Book Festival, which is why I already knew what you can already also know, which is that Finn here is going to be on a panel about YA horror called Horror, the Body as Villain or Hero, on October 25th at 11 a.m. with Brian Lasala, Kaylin Bayron, and Katie B. Cohn. That should be an absolutely incredible conversation. These are all just phenomenal writers who really know their stuff. And that particular panel is free. So I hope to see you all at the Boston Book Festival. In the meantime, grab your books. You can line up here, and Finn will sign. Thank you.
Thank you.